People sometimes wonder what where my perspectives come from. Why do I think the way that I think? The only way to explain it is to tell you who I am. Some of what I'm going to say might not be easy for everybody to hear, so slight trigger warning. There is some mention of childhood trauma in this conversation, so if you don't want to watch, you don't want to carry on, you want to leave it from here, just click off and go, you look at something else. Alright, so I was born in Germany in 1964 to my German mother and Scottish father. Now, he wasn't in the forces or anything like that, they just happened to be living there at the time I was born. I was born in a town called Holtzminden, and I was there until I was 4 years old, and then my parents took me, shall we say, kicking and screaming on a boat to Scotland, and I've been here ever since. Unfortunately, my father was somewhat abusive, and this was something that manifested once we arrived in Scotland. This wasn't something I experienced while still in Germany, perhaps because there were grandparents around regularly and other family, perhaps when we came to Scotland, he was in his own environment and felt more free and able to be more of himself. So I start school at 5 years old, and I go to school, and of course I've got a rather strong, at that point, German accent. Bearing in mind I came to Scotland then in 1968, and I would have started school at 5 years old in 1969. This isn't all that long after the end of the Second World War, so of course memories lingered in the minds of people around at the time. Some of the kids I went to school with could have easily had relatives who died in the war. Their parents would have certainly had, people they knew, relatives and friends who would have died in the war. And there was still an awful lot of anti-German feeling kicking around Scotland. This isn't an excuse for it, it's not a justification, it's just true. It was the culture of the time and the society as it was then. So naturally I drew some unwanted attention from his fellow school kids. Where do you come from? Not recognising the accent. I was born in Germany. I can't even do the accent properly now. Then would come chased, beatings, slapped, chased again, kicked. I have permanent scar on my forehead from a time I was running from bullies. Split my head on the steps leading into the school building. Teachers, did nothing. It was the German boy that caused it. So there's still a lot of implicit, xenophobia among teaching staff as well, who, by the way, may have lost people they loved during the war. Or their parents may have. Or they may have lost parents, so it was a bit like that. Did you remember that I said my father was abusive? So I would go to school in the morning, terrified to go to school, thinking I was going to get bullied. I would come home at late, terrified to go home at night, knowing I was going to get a beating at home and I wouldn't know why. He'd be watching the news and a 5-year-old makes a noise and gets a hiding. So that carries on until I'm around 8 years old, and my mother takes her 2 kids, myself and my sister, walks out of the family home, has a nervous breakdown, and my sister and I end up in care. Particular care home we ended up in, quite soon, was called Burnside Children's Home, and that was in Irvine in Ayrshire, because I had grown up at that point when we came to Scotland in Ayr. That place was like a prison for children. You could actually take my life and create a remake of Oliver Twist set in the 1970s and it looked relatively realistic. So I end up in Aberdeen at 11 years old, and this is just cutting a long story short. After some time in care with different foster parents, being back staying with their mother for a little while, ending up being abandoned outside the welfare offices in Ayr because she couldn't cope. And I end up with my sister in a children's home in Aberdeen. That place was like an oasis among children's homes of that time. Children's homes, you may have heard, were not nice places during the 1970s. That one in Aberdeen was like an oasis. Could have saved my life. The people in it actually cared. The house parents treated those kids like real kids, like children who needed a little bit of discipline, but never lifted a hand to them. And the discipline was an old-fashioned kind that involved normal rules. You don't get to go out to play. If you're a bad boy, you go to your room. The kind of way you're supposed to bring up kids. So I grew up, having been rescued, if you like, in that place, and eventually become a lot better adjusted than I might have been otherwise. But a couple of things linger within me, apart from the natural traumas, potential CPTSD and whatever else. A couple of things lingered. A hatred of bullies. A hatred of bullies. A hatred of xenophobia and other forms of bigotry. Having actually experienced it, because what I haven't mentioned up to this point, the bullying that happened at school because I was German took on different variations. Kids shouting, Nazi, Nazi, Nazi. Kraut, Kraut, Kraut. I'm not a Nazi, I'm not a Nazi. Jew, Jew, Jew. I'm not a Jew. I didn't know any difference. I'm not a Jew. See me in the toilets. He's not a Jew. Nazi, Nazi, Nazi. Yeah. So, while not a Jew, you can almost say I must be, one of the non-Jews who actually experienced anti-Semitism. In a sense, because it happened as a child. And of course, not failing to notice perhaps I'm German and I have a slightly, there are other reasons for having a slightly prominent proboscis perhaps, but there is that kind of association where people sometimes draw extremely unkind caricatures of Jews where they have large noses and other kind of facial features sometimes associated with them. People might have looked at me and saw odd features that they associated with that and made the assumption it's because they knew where I was born. So I did grow up, not liking that. Then I found out something else. I'm getting to around 13, 14, 15 years old, and I'm living with mother again, and she starts to explain to me some of the things that happened with her when she was in Germany during the war. Now, my mother was born in 1926. She passed away in 2015. She spent her entire teenage years in Germany under the Nazis during the Second World War. She was 13 in 1939 and 19 in 1945. Her entire teenage years were experienced during wartime Germany. She told me a story where she had a Saturday job. I think she was around 15 or 16. She had a Saturday job working in a local shop in Holtzminden. Just so happens that this shop was run by a Jewish couple. One day she, goes to work on Saturday as usual, and the doors are all shuttered down, and she just never sees that couple again. There is a story among members of my family that our grandparents on the German side did contribute towards some people escaping the Nazis. Part of the explanation for that might be found in them living in that area relatively close to the Dutch border, which would have been on that kind of escape route channels towards Holland and away from the Nazis for people who were escaping, be they Jews, be they airmen or whatever. So I remember the story, you know, a little detail of the story. My grandfather, my German grandfather, had a wine cellar underneath the house. And they used to kill chickens and things like that. And my grandfather apparently, you know, knew that the residual blood from the culling of chickens for food, you know, could provide plausible deniability in the event that anyone arrived who was, you know, being helped and being, you know, kept there safely for a little while on their route out, might have had injuries that would have otherwise looked as if, you know, it would have otherwise looked suspicious to any Germans that may have had a look around. So they were potentially, you know, helping people escape the Nazis. The irony of me being bullied for being German, but my family actually helping the victims of the Nazis during the war. I find out just a few years ago that I have, you know, my DNA, my North European DNA, that half of me that was German could have actually been more Dutch than German. So it could well be that my German family had Dutch heritage, as you know, as I said, that they were relatively close to the Dutch border. So that was the history of, you know, a little bit of the history of my family. I apologise for the bits that might be a little bit, you know, upsetting to anyone to hear. Just wanted you to know a little bit more about who I am, where I come from, why I think the way that I think, you know, where some of my perspectives comes from, why I'm very empathetic towards Jewish people as well, for example, you know, and why I generally don't like bigotry, and why I'm so dead against bullying behaviour, no matter from where it comes. So I hope it understands, you know, I hope it helps you understand a little bit more about me and who I am. So when you see future content, you see what I have to say, you can take it in context. All right, thanks very much and see you again. Bye.